Aloha and welcome to week 2 of CM400Z. This week, we will be learning about app design and wireframing as a design tool. You have this lecture to watch, and I've assigned an Apple Dev video to watch as well. The title of that video is Ingredients of Great Apps. I've uploaded instructions on how to access all Apple Dev videos. You can find this document under the Resources tab in Laulima. Let's review from last week. So what did we learn last week? From Landscape of Mobile App Development and Design, we learned about the 3 app goals: solve a problem, captivate, and connect. The 5 W's: why, what, who, where, and when. And the 3 E's: we want to make sure that our apps are easy, entertaining, and it executes a task. So from the Mobile App Anatomy and Types of Mobile Apps lecture, we learned about the user interface, we learned a little bit about logic, and we learned about a little bit about data persistence. And also the 4 main types of apps: data-driven apps, game apps, device apps, and custom functionality and utility apps. All right, today we're going to be learning about the app planning process, which includes design principles and learning how to wireframe. When starting the app creation process, planning is key. App projects that have a clear plan laid out are more likely to succeed and come to fruition. As a designer, it's really important to distinguish the difference between user interface and user experience. Let's learn about the two. So what is the difference? The user interface, or UI, connects users to the underlying technology. It is through the UI and the UI elements, the user interface elements, such as buttons, text fields, and lists, that users can perform tasks and actions. Through the design of the UI, you can thoughtfully communicate with the user about your app. Remember that the design makes you want the product. So the design of the UI is very important to the user. So if the UI is what the user sees, touches, and interacts with, what is the user experience, or UX? The UX encompasses the entire experience users have with your product, or your app in this case. That experience includes the user interface and much more. Let's think about what a good UX looks like. So a good UX experience is simple and elegant. The app meets the needs of the user. Good understanding of how to use the product. So as soon as the user opens up the product, it's understood how to use it. The product makes the user feel good, and this is where design really comes into play. You can emotionally connect to your user through your design. Also, a good user experience considers UI designs and new hardware capabilities of the mobile device itself. It's also defined by ease of use. And user experience can also be affected by the layout of the user interface. As I mentioned, the visual design, the text, the brand, the sound, and the way that the user interacts with it. And the last two are attractiveness of the user experience and user interface, and product convenience. Is it easy to use? One of the biggest concepts to grasp in mobile design is how to create an intuitive UI. As most of you know, most mobile applications do not come with an instruction set. From the get-go, as soon as the user opens the app, he or she relies on the intuitiveness of the UI. In other words, no manual is required. Well-designed products shouldn't need user manuals, online help, or training to use. Let's discuss some of the attributes of an intuitive UI. So these attributes are actually in the McKay text, page 26, and he talks about discoverability. The entry point of the app is very clear. Understandability. The app takes seconds to figure out. Affordance. Visual cues are available and obvious and conventional. Efficiency. Performing tasks are seamless. Responsive feedback. UI is responsive, so there's a thoughtful app flow. Forgiveness. User is guided back to a task at hand if misdirected via alert views or other ways. And then there's explorability. The UI encourages the user to explore without fear of getting lost. And so there's levels of intuitiveness, and I wanted to point out this illustration, this table in McKay's text, page 34. Notice that the level of intuitiveness is linked to usability. So if we look at the first section, which is intuitive, if the design attributes are intuitive, meaning they meet the attributes of intuitive UI, users will be able to accomplish their goals without any trouble and or instruction. So this is, of course, the ideal situation. Usable. If the design is usable, it may take users a moment to figure out how to accomplish tasks and or actions using the application. But nonetheless, as intuitive design decreases, so does the usability. So users will gradually move through a usability experience that makes sense and takes a little bit of time to figure out, and it may require a little trial and error. And then, of course, if the design is completely unusable, which means it lacks any intuitive UI attributes that I talked about in the earlier slide, it does a poor job communicating and or signaling anything to the user via the design. The consequence of this is that users will most likely never use the app and or delete it completely from their mobile device. As an app designer, this is the result that you absolutely want to avoid. So now we're going to move on to design principles. And one thing that McKay emphasizes in his text, this is from page 8 and 9 in the McKay text, is that really the user interface is a conversation. So if that's the case, remember that through the design of your app, you are essentially communicating to the user how to use it. So you're putting in those cues, things like affordance, placement, layout. The UI should explain tasks clearly. You should only include UI elements such as buttons, text fields, navigation, toolbars, and graphics that are absolutely necessary. Remember, you want things to be simple and elegant. All UI elements should communicate something. As mentioned earlier, every UI element should have a specific purpose. If it doesn't, then it shouldn't be included on the UI. UI should feel like a natural, professional, and friendly conversation. This is always at the discretion of the designer and something you will need to decide, but the UI should feel natural, meaning that designs and graphics that you use should appropriately reflect the theme of the application. Your design should feel welcoming, and the goal is always to connect to the user on an emotional level. Users are humans and not robots, so this is really good to remember. Users enjoy apps that are aesthetically pleasing, so that's really like the designer's role to make the experience fun through your design, through your color palette. UI tone should be polite, respectful, and intelligent. The design of the UI should do all it can to support the user's experience. At the wireframe level, every visual design element should be justified by what it communicates. Great design starts from great wireframes, which is what we're going to go over later. Once you've established your final app wireframes, not much should change from the final wireframe to design phase, when you're designing in Adobe, the Creative Suite, and then to app prototype. App prototype is something we're going to be learning later in the semester. Yeah, and I can't emphasize enough, people react emotionally to a product's visual appearance. It's hard to argue that a design will decide whether or not the user wants the product. If you put two apps side by side that have the same quality of features and functionality, the app with a more simple and elegant design will win over the user. So something to really think about. And then lastly, implement a communication-driven design process. There are lots of strategies you can implement to help you with the design process. This includes creating a value proposition and defining your user personas. All right, so now we went through what is an intuitive UI, levels of intuitiveness, and design principles. We're going to shift gears and turn our focus towards Mendoza's user experience or UX patterns. These mobile UX patterns will help with wireframing your applications. And in his book, he provides 7 UX patterns that you can kind of start with. And we're going to kind of quickly go through all these patterns, and I'll make a little comment on each one. So we're going to start out with the launcher. Okay. The launcher pattern is a springboard, or what I like to call the home screen of your application. Mendoza breaks the launcher pattern into 2 main components, the header and the work area. If you look at the image on the right, you see that the header is at the top of the screen. The work area takes up the majority of the space of the screen, as you can see in his illustration. The header is important in that it provides a space for app branding across the UX, the user experience. In terms of navigation, some apps will diverge from having the navigation exclusively located in the heading. Remember that the navigation can range from bento box, slider cards, tab bar navigation, a combination of the two, or a designer and a developer can actually customize a navigation to create a new type of user experience. The work area is where the main content of the app sits. If we look at well-known apps like Facebook or Instagram, the work area is filled in by news feeds or photo updates of friends you're following. It's important that your work area captures your users from the start of the user experience, so from the start of the launching of the application. Okay, so the tray pattern is another elegant way to launch your application. Instead of having a navigation bar in the header of the app, you would include an active button, which is labeled 1 in the illustration on the left. Next to the action button would be an ideal area to place your app branding logo. So in that kind of, if you look at the image on the left, that top area where it's yellow, you could put your app logo where it's blank. So there's 2 main components to the tray pattern, the active button and the tray area. So the active button is essentially universally communicates that if pressed, more options will be presented to the user. All right, so here's a great example that I'm guessing many of you are familiar with. The Facebook app utilizes the tray pattern. As you can see, it has the action button on the top left there, and it's part of its user experience. Looking at the right side of the illustration, we see the active button has the left side of the illustration, we see that the active button has not been pressed. The main content on the screen is the newsfeed, however. However, if the user wants to navigate to a certain part of the application, the user presses the active button to access the tray area. And like I said, the tray area serves as another way for the user to navigate to different parts of the app. oftentimes the design of the tray area lists the most viewed parts of the app to the least viewed parts of the app. So perhaps the designer just decided that your profile is a place that should sit at the top. Newsfeed should come second because that's probably where users spend a lot, or if not most of their time. So there is some prioritization that occurs in how you lay out the tray. All right, so now we have the list pattern, and in some cases, it could be part of the main navigation of an app. However, it will be a secondary way to navigate through an application. The pattern is usually made up of three main components. So you got the list item, the navigation bar, and you get the navigation buttons. The list item includes a table view with individual cells where you as a designer can place text that indicate to the user different parts of the app to navigate to. Notice that in each cell, it's convention to include an arrow in each cell to indicate to the user that the cell responds to a touch event. So if you see that arrow, there's 4 arrows if you look at the image on the far left. And then when the user taps on a specific cell, they are taken to a specific part of the application. So you'll see that there's another list. So it's kind of like a list nested within another list. The navigation bar allows the user to quickly identify which part of the app they are in. So typically the text of the cell the user selected will then appear in the navigation bar title of the next screen. And lastly, the navigation button enables the user to navigate back to the list item or first screen of the list pattern. So if you look at number 3, that back button is the navigation button. It allows the user to go back to the second screen, and that back button allows them to go back to the first screen. Probably a sequence that you guys are very familiar with. All right, so here's a close-up view of the main components of the list pattern. Once again, you have the list view, the navigation bar, and the navigation buttons. So continuing on with the list view, as you enter into the nested views of this pattern, ultimately it leads you to a detail view. A detail view will contain useful information for the users and oftentimes includes photos. Sometimes these detail views can also include audio and video. But besides providing more details on a venue, item to purchase, or user profile, eventually the end result of providing the user with a detail view is to allow them to perform an action or a task. In this example, final user interaction allows the user to add the item to the cart via the button on the very bottom. So you see that the detail view allows the user to ultimately add this product to their cart, and then therefore they can purchase this product. All right, the rotate pattern. This enables you as a designer to enhance the user experience by providing the option to use the app both in portrait and landscape mode. Generally speaking, most applications utilize only the portrait mode. On the other hand, game apps will take advantage of the landscape mode to provide the best UX and gameplay for their users. The main components of the rotate pattern is, of course, the rotation, which is the gesture that is triggered, that the accelerometer within the mobile device responds to, the rotation. And then the second component is the horizontal or vertical screen. So that's number 2 in this photo here. Note that as a designer, in landscape mode, you may be able to include a menu or navigation, which may not have been possible in the portrait mode. The main thing to consider with the rotate pattern is whether or not the UX is enhanced, right? So is the user experience enhanced by allowing for both portrait and landscape mode? So something to think about. For, like I said, for the most part, most applications are locked into portrait mode. All right, and here we go, login pattern. So obviously this is probably very familiar with all of you. If you decide to use the login pattern in your app, it will usually be the first screen the user is taken to when the application is launched for the very first time. However, after the user initially signs in and decides to remain signed in, the next time the user launches the app, it would bypass the login page. Nonetheless, the login pattern is made up of three components. The login, right? The sign up, which is number 2. And in case you always have to have something built into your application, and also in the design of what happens if the user forgets their password. How do they retrieve their password? All right, so parts of the login screen. So if we look at part 1, that consists of the text fields where the user enters their name or username and password. Please note that as a designer, you may want to add in placeholder text to indicate to the user that this is a text field where they can input their username and password. So you see in the illustration in the text fields, there's that placeholder text that says username and then of course password in the second text field. Parts 2 and 3 include the login button and the color of the button. So number 3 is kind of goes into the color of the button. Once the user enters his or her name and password, the login button is pressed to confirm the username and of course the password. From a design perspective, an important consideration to make here is the color of the login button. You definitely want to stick with your color palette when considering, which color to use for your button. But you also want to draw attention to this UI element in particular. So part 4, ask the designer to consider the modal appearance of the keyboard once a text field is activated. And what I mean by modal, it appears, usually comes up from the bottom of the app screen. If the placement of your text fields and the login button do not consider the space the keyboard will take, the user will not be able to see the text they type and or access the login button. So this is pretty important. And then of course section 5 is more of a development concern. As the designer and developer, you want to agree that the login process will usually be a one-time event, and the user credentials are saved on the phone, and he or she doesn't have to log in again and again and again, unless he or she signs out of the application. So that's at the sort of user's discretion. And then, as many of you know, login screen using social integration is very, very important. And you probably know this from your own mobile experience. There are other more advanced ways to sign into an app, which can be done via email, Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, etc. As we move forward in the design process, I encourage each of you to look at the login pattern design of other applications that use social integration. When considering using the advanced login pattern as a designer, you should be asking yourself, is social media integration important for the user experience? And will my application require users to create a profile? If so, social integration will enable your app to access user profile information from the user's Facebook, Twitter, and/or other social media accounts. So, yeah, this is maybe something that if you are, working on a design development team, you and the developer will kind of make that decision together. And of course, we can't forget about the camera pattern. This allows users to take a photo and capture the moment whenever and wherever they are. The three main components of the camera pattern are, of course, the camera screen, the confirm add filter, which is optional for the user to do. And then, of course, there's the action and share screen, which is probably the most important part of all of this pattern. So your app's purpose and goals will help you determine whether or not you will need to include the camera pattern in your UX. The main purpose of the camera screen is to provide the user with the largest view possible so he or she can frame the shot. Additionally, it is from the camera screen the user is able to access the library of photos via a button on the bottom left corner of the screen. That's usual convention. The confirm add filter screen is typically accessed via a button on the bottom right side of the camera screen. And then in the filter screen, the user is able to add filtering preferences to enhance or stylize the image to his or her liking. And then lastly, the action share screen enables users to share their photos via email, text, or of course, social media. So the camera, that kind of viewing area, can also be programmed to have scanning capabilities. So if you want to scan like a QR code, and of course you want to consider whether or not scanning capabilities fit within your app's purpose or your goals as the designer developer or your client's goals. This specialized capability is something that the client may specifically request, and if that's the case, then you need to include that in the design. And you will be responsible to add these components into the app wireframe and flow. So this is the last pattern that Mendoza talks about. It's the map and location pattern. And this pattern is used by many different applications. I'm sure you recognize it. Typically speaking, this pattern will be used in apps that utilize user-centric location-based data in concert with the device's GPS capabilities. The three main components are the location, search, so probably like the opening page, the map page, of course, and then usually map pages open up if you kind of go deeper into a map view. You will eventually get into the location detail page. So the location search page screen can be designed in many different ways, but essentially it allows the user to choose or search for a location based on criteria or search options provided to the user via the user interface. Once the user decides a course of action, the user will be taken to a map page where typically he or she can view venue location in relation to his or her own location. So that's always something that's included in any map view. You want to include the user, so it's a user-centric map. All right, so let's kind of talk a little bit more about the location detail page. The map view, like I said, is the most often is most often followed by the option of viewing a location detail page screen. And this is usually done when the user selects a pin on the map page. So for example, this red orange pin here, if we go back to number 2 screen, if you press one of those pins, it'll take you to screen number 3. And then, of course, this is the location detail page. Of course, it provides the user with information so he or she can make a decision on what to do. So going back to the theory behind the detail page, you want to give the user a task to accomplish here, help them make a decision. Are they going to reserve a table at this restaurant? And keep in mind that when the user goes into a detail view, as the designer, you want to, as I mentioned, provide the user with an opportunity to take an action. That's very important. Like I said, number 3, they can, on here, you can either reserve a table, or maybe you want to share the details of this venue or restaurant to somebody via social media. All right. So following this lecture, I encourage each of you to search for apps that will get you excited and inspired. There's over 1 million apps on the App Store alone for Apple. I'm not sure what that figure is for the Android market, but I'm sure it's very close to 1 million. And so if you don't know where to start, finding apps to get you excited and inspired, I provided a few links here to apps that I found pretty cool and inspirational. I do want to make mention that a lot of these apps are linked to hardware, so that's a strong pathway now that mobile app development is going into, is connecting your phone with an actual device, maybe that's at your home, a device that you're wearing. So definitely take a look at these projects. They're really cool. Now we're going to kind of shift gears from UX patterns and to using wireframing as a design tool. And as designers, you guys are really familiar with the design process, and sketching things out, kind of like through trial and error. So where do you begin? And I basically call this paper prototyping, wireframing, and this is really all you need. You need paper, pens, ideas, and then of course your guiding questions, and I'm going to talk about some of the guiding questions later. You're actually going to be doing some work on guiding questions in your homework number 2 as well. But if you are a technologist and not interested in sketching, although I highly encourage it, there's wireframing softwares that are available. Feel free to check out these wireframing applications. They're available online. Some are free, or they may have a free trial period, or they're just available for purchase. So what is wireframing? It involves sketching every unique view in your app flow. Views can include content in table views, text views, images, graphics, or other features. The emphasis here is on unique app flow, because within a typical application, parts of the app will follow the same UX patterns. So you don't want to be sketching out the same app flow over and over again, even if they're pressing like a different cell on say the list view. When wireframing your application, your goal is to demonstrate different pathways that the user will experience. This will become more clear as you begin creating your own wireframes. So why wireframe? It's industry standard. Like any dev shop you go to, they all wireframe. Wireframes will allow you as a designer to design with priority in mind. Understanding what's most important will enable you to design certain screens over others. It will enable you to decide the hierarchy structure of a list view, for example. Wireframing helps you to better understand the usability, including the intuitiveness of your app. You may have an idea, and then when you start sketching it out, you're like, actually, this isn't quite intuitive. So that's why we wireframe. Wireframing is very cost-effective process. If you make a mistake, you can simply erase it or sketch something else very quickly. Wireframing saves time, which also translates into saving money for you and your client. And then through wireframing, you're able to better visualize and include UI elements that are absolutely essential. Additionally, you can view different ways to place UI elements such as buttons and text fields on the UI and decide quickly what looks good and what doesn't look good. And then, of course, these are some of the guiding questions that you'll be kind of referring to as you're wireframing. What's the most important action a user should take on the screen? What is happening on the screen? Does it make sense to you? Is it intuitive? What's the most important feature of the screen? What is the most important UI element? Where does each UI element lead the user? So this is part of understanding the app flow. So if you press a button, you definitely want to demonstrate like where that user is going to be taken. So that's what I refer to as app flow. And what should the user do here? Does the design make it clear to the user what he or she needs to do on this screen? So these are questions that should be running through your mind every time you're creating a wireframe for a screen. All right. And nonetheless, it's always good to have goals. So you have your guiding questions, and then of course you have your goals. By definition, prototyping is the process of creating a sample before a final version is made. Prototyping is used to create a version of software that you can test drive and learn from. So page flow, right? What is page flow? Does the flow of the pages and the screens make sense to the user? Is it easy to learn and navigate? Do we need to shorten or change the experience in any way, and why? Does our user experience pattern fit into the user's expectations? So this is really kind of designing with the user in mind. Like, does the flow of the app, would it make sense to the user? Is it predictable? Is it familiar? These are things that you want to think about in page flow or screen flow. Or I usually will refer to this as app flow. User interface interaction. So some of the goals you want to meet are that all the gestures are clear. When we call a keyboard or picker from the device, does the logic make sense? Are we using UI elements that the user expects to see or is familiar with? With this feedback, we can focus on optimizing the mechanics of a specific screen, task, action, or function. And then, of course, device interaction. What do our screens look like on the actual device? Is the use of the accelerometer clear? If you are rotating the screen, of course, how does that look on the device? If you design your experience for multiple screens, does it adapt well? So multiple size screens. We can use this feedback from actual devices to help us optimize the scale, proportion, and interaction of experience with the device. So really device interaction, that's when you start getting into like high fidelity prototyping when you're prototyping on the actual device. So at that stage, your wireframes are completely completed. So here's just a little wireframe example that I found online, and I thought it was kind of cool. It has little comments. It has the list view pattern here. And I just wanted to demonstrate here that this is industry standard. This is where people start apps. And then, okay, so now that we learned about the wireframing process, let's take a quick look at my latest app project. I'm currently working on building a travel app for Hawaii. And let's take a quick peek at the first 3 wireframes that I created. All right, so here we have the wireframes for the first 3 screens of the application that I'm currently working on. The first screen, which is the home screen, allows users to browse different areas of interest, particularly while folks are traveling or out and about. The user selects an area of interest and takes them to screen 2, right? And in screen 2, the user has the option to view places of interest or venues that the user would like to explore. And then lastly, screen 3, which follows the map and location pattern we talked about earlier, allows the user to see all places of interest on a map in relation to his or her location. So here I'm really using the map and location pattern. So that's pattern number 7 in Mendoza's book. Okay, and as developers, many times we have to play a design role as well as a development role. Nonetheless, as I mentioned, it's industry standard to always start a new project with wireframes. So even if you're a developer and you don't have a designer on your team, you bet we have to wireframe what we can without knowing much about design, or we'll just have to sketch out what we can best sketch out. And then let's take a look at the first 3 screens that's already been programmed in the Xcode simulator. So we're going to switch gears here. And so if we look back at, let's go back to this wireframe here. So that's the wireframe, right? And that's screen 1. So if we click on morning grub and coffee, we get all these nice breakfast locations that are located near me, where I currently am, and then you can view that on the map. And of course, this map needs to be scaled and adjusted because that's not the kind of view you want to give your user. You want to give them a more zoomed in location. But so these are the different venues here. And of course, this is my current location, this blue dot here. So that blue dot is convention in a conventional design to indicate that that's where the user is. All right, so we saw the simulation there. And what did we learn today? So we learned about UI versus UX, attributes of an intuitive UI. So I've listed the pages there where you can find that information. design principles, Mendoza's 7 UX patterns, and I just simulated a use of his pattern in my latest project. And then wireframing basic tools. Wireframing basics. So the tools, guiding questions, and goals. So following this lecture this week, there's assignment number 2, and also don't forget to watch the Apple development video, Ingredients of Great Apps. If you have any questions regarding today's lecture, assignment number 2, and or if you have trouble finding the video or signing up to become an Apple developer, feel free to email me and I will get back to you as soon as I can.